mentioned last week, it's a interesting book, this Corinthians letter, the letter to the Corinthians. Paul is having to do a lot of this defending himself. Remember, takes place about 55 AD or so. So Jesus was crucified, rose from the dead about 33 AD or so. Paul was converted from being a guy that hated Christians and hated Jesus to loving Christians and loving Jesus. And he went out, his mission from God was to go and spread the good news of God to the world through Jesus. And so he did that very thing. And one of the places he went was Corinth, and was there and had done this work, planted a church, left, and then some people came in and began disparaging him. And he knew about it, and he heard about it. In fact, there's a list, I had a list of 10 things that Paul knew. Like, people talk behind your back sometimes. Is it worse behind your back or when you find out to your face what they really think about you? I don't know which. Neither one's good. Well, Paul heard what was going on about him. Too timid. He's fickle. He's a flake. He's physically underwhelming, to put it nicely. Doesn't speak very well. There are all these things that Paul writes, like, I know you think this about me, about the certain people. And so he's in this position of planting a church. The people loved him. They came to know Jesus through him. He leaves and people come in, begin spreading slander and gossip about him to where the church is starting to divide. They don't know whether they should put their trust in him and what it is that he has to say. And so Paul is kind of in this awkward spot. He goes, we don't have all the letters apparently of Paul's correspondence and his visits with them, but apparently he goes and tries to get things to work out and it explodes. This is a toxic situation. Not good comes from it, and so Paul leaves. His intention is to come back again, but realizes that right now it's such a mess right there that it only makes it worse for him to come. So rather than going and just kind of getting this thing rehashed and just turning even worse than it is, he writes this letter to them to get this thing going, because Paul wants restoration in this. Now here's the thing, here's the gospel. If you need the gospel kind of condensed to you, the story of the New Testament, the story of Jesus, the story of God is about reconciliation, it's about restoration, it's about redemption. Right? That's what it's all about. God throughout history, his goal has been to bring his children to him. That's what he wants. That's his desire. You as a parent, that is your desire, I would assume. If there's conflict or if there's problems that are going on, your goal is to restore. Your goal is to redeem, get them back. Your goal is to reconcile with them. We do not like relationships that are irreconcilable. We don't want that. And it happens sometimes in life, and we realize that, but generally speaking, we want to be reconciled. We want to be back with the people. Paul is this way. Maybe you've had these kind of relationships before, and if you could even have a story maybe that you could tell of a time where there was a breach of relationship, a breach of you guys being together, and then because of whatever, your willingness to swallow whatever it is that went on, your willingness to endure whatever it is that took place, you did so for the sake of the relationship, for the sake of things being put back together. And so maybe you totally get what it is that's going on here. Paul is emulating God in this story that we're looking at today. God's story, again, has been to reconcile, to bring people back, to restore them into relationship with them. Remember the story of the prodigal son? That's one of the big stories that whether you go to church or not, you've probably heard that story before. It's a story of God being the father going out to the younger son that's rebellious, bringing him into the house and saying, you were dead, but now you're alive. It's a story of the father going out to the older son that's having a hissy fit in the field because he doesn't feel like things are fair, and yet the father still goes out to him and says, come in and have a party. He's always about wanting to restore. He's wanting to bring relationship between he and his children, his sons and his daughters. In 2 Peter, when people are wondering, is God ever going to bring Jesus back? Is Jesus ever going to come back? Is the second coming going to happen? It seems like it's taking forever. And Peter's point is, look, God is not slow as you count slowness, but he's patient because he does not want to lose anyone. His desire is that all men and women would come to know him. That is his heart. That's his passion. Did God have to swallow stuff in order to get to this point of allowing us to come to know him? Absolutely. He came in the form of a man, Jesus, who came and endured scorn, endured shame, emptied himself, we read in another letter from Paul, emptied himself, becoming the form of a servant. All of this for the sake of you, for the sake of me. That is God's heart. And so he comes, we read later on, Paul's going to talk about this in 2 Corinthians 5 when we get to it, that he was reconciling the world through Jesus to bring us into relationship with him. And what that meant is God had to be the bigger man, so to speak, and be willing to give up his rights, give up his standing as the right to say, hey, I don't want anything to do with you, you've blown the relationship and we're finished, and rather submitting himself to death on a cross so that you could come to know him and so that I could come to know him. This is God's story, and this becomes Paul's story. If you know the story of Jesus, and we went through this in John, remember Jesus at they had their communion, their Last Supper, so to speak, and he said to the disciples, a new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. And part of that, loving one another as Jesus has loved us, is there are times when we have to give up our rights. Give up our, yes, I know I'm in the correctness in this situation, but I'm willing to let it go for your sake, to let it go for the sake of the relationship. Paul is doing that in this story that's here. Okay, so Paul is realizing that if he comes, that he is going to make things worse. Paul also realizes that if he doesn't come, they're going to accuse him of being fickle. They're going to accuse him of not following the Lord because he had intended to do something and now his mind has been changed. And so he caught grief for that too. It's one of those, I guess you can't say it, darned if you do, darned if you don't. Can you say that in church? But you can't, either way, whatever he does. And so Paul has to make a decision. What is going to be his attitude? What is going to be his posture toward these people? And Paul's posture is, I'm going to eat it. I'm willing to eat it. I'm willing to be thought of as not spiritual. I'm willing to be thought of as being fickle, of changing my mind for the sake of the bigger picture. And Paul's biggest picture is, I want that man restored into fellowship with us again. And so even if it means that I have to be looked at as the bad guy in this situation, I'm going to do it. You have had relationships, or maybe you've had to have that too, where you just had to say, look, I may be in the right, but you know what? The Lord's going to have to fight this battle. It's not for me to do. It needs to be for him, because my idea, my goal is on the big picture. And I have to decide what is more important, my rights and my being right in this situation, or the big picture of what is best for this person that I am working with. And Paul, taking a cue from Jesus, does the very thing. I want this man to be restored. I want this man to know fellowship again with the church, and in that sense, fellowship with God. And so I am willing to take on the bad guy role for the sake of this thing being worked out. This man was disparaging Paul, disparaging his ministry, whatever it was that was going on, and Paul was willing to eat it in view of the big picture. So this morning, let me ask you this. Who do you love enough? Who do you care about so much that you are willing to submit yourself to do whatever it takes for that person's restoration, for that person's reconciliation, for that person's redemption? Specifically, what we're looking at here is with the Lord. What am I willing to do? We have parents, we have kids, we have siblings, we have co-workers, we have people maybe that we just don't even like, that we can't stand, that we have a circle of influence with. Are we willing, like Paul, like God, like Jesus, to see the big picture and realize that their ultimate relationship with God is what is most important? And I'm willing to do what is necessary in order to bring that person to be with the Lord, that they could be reconciled. Am I willing to let it go, whatever it might be? Am I willing to forgive, if that be the case? What is it that is necessary? My behavior, my attitude towards that person, my actions toward that person, so that they too are able to be restored, able to be right with the Lord. That's the big picture. That's what Paul is looking at. This is a man that has disparaged him, and yet his goal is not to rip on the guy, But his goal is to forgive the guy so that he can be restored again. And man, that's hard for us, isn't it? Because we're human. Because when someone comes at us, because when someone slanders us, when someone gossips us, then we want to come right back at them. You know, and we can do it aggressively, we can do it passively, we can do a, end run and share with other people so that, it makes very clear. I mean, those are our human reactions to that sort of thing. Paul had a very legitimate case to say, just kick the guy out. This is my church. I planted this church. It's the Lord's church. He's causing problems. Get him out of here. But Paul wants restoration with this. And Paul realized that if he goes and meets with them right now, that's going to be about judgment. That's going to be about making a decision that this guy needs to go. Paul understands that, and he doesn't want that to happen. And so in between, his hope is that this incident that's happened and what would be an ultimate judgment, that within this, restoration can take place before that. Forgiveness can take place before that. Redemption can take place before that. Reconciliation can take place before that. This again is the story of the gospel. We have breached a relationship with God because of our sin, because of the things that we have done. Ultimately, Jesus is going to come back. We understand that. A second coming, and then there will be a judgment at that point. If you're in the book of life, great, and if you're not, not good. In between that time, this is God's plan. Restoration, reconciliation, redemption. Jesus has not come back yet because God is continuing to share that he loves, that he forgives, that he wants you to be in relationship with him. He does not want to immediately judge the first sin and say, you're out of my family, I never want to see you again. That's not the heart of God. The heart of God is, I am waiting as long as I can so that you will come to know me. That's what I want. And Paul is doing that in this story too. I am waiting as long as I can. Rather than go and pronounce judgment on this, I am holding back. At my reputation, at my rights, I'm letting those things go because this is more important than that. It's hard to do. We see it so rarely, especially whether it's social media, but not even just that, but even in a relationship with each other. It is so rare at times to see someone willing to give up their right to be angry, their right to hate, their right to hold a grudge, their right to hold bitterness, and say instead, I want the big picture for you. Yeah, you've hurt me deeply, but here's the big picture. I want you to know Christ. And so I'm willing to let this thing go. Man, easier said than done, right? Easier said than done. But it happens. It happens on occasion. Maybe it's happened in your life. It's happened recently. I'll show you a video here. You're familiar with, I'm sure, the Bothan Jean case of Texas, where the man that was shot from the police officer, the lady, that lived a floor down from him, that had either mistaken the floor, whatever. Anyway, the bottom line is she shot and killed Bothan Jean in that. And so, of course, there's going to be anger, there's going to be frustration, all those things. But we see what Paul is talking about here, and we see the story of God, of what's going on in Bothan Jean's brother, Brant, who gives this speech, to Amber Guygan, the one who shot his brother. And so I wanted to show that because this is a great example of what it means to let go of what you have a right to be for the sake of the bigger picture.
Can I give her a hug, please?
Compassion, grace.
Yes.
Whatever you call it, in a hushed courtroom in Texas tonight, we witnessed it. 18-year-old Brant Jean forgiving Amber Guygan, his brother's killer.
If you truly are sorry, I know I can speak for myself. I forgive you. I know if you go to God and ask him, he will forgive you. I don't even want you to go to jail. I want the best for you. Because I know that's exactly what both of them would want you to do.
This unlikely ending, perhaps the biggest surprise in a case that captivated the nation.
So in that, it's just, again, reality, right? It's one thing to talk, it's another thing to live it. And yet Brant was willing to live it. And that's what Paul is wanting to do with this person. That is what God is wanting to do with you. That is what God is wanting to do with your mother, your father, your son, your daughter, your husband, your wife, your best friend, your enemy, your co-worker, whoever it may be. That is God's desire. We see there kind of a living example of what it means to have a right to be angry, to have a right to hold bitterness, to hold a grudge to something, and yet letting it go, because the bigger picture is eternity. The bigger picture is restoration with God. The bigger picture is knowing Jesus and wanting that for that person. I don't know that I could do that, honestly, and hopefully I never have to be in that situation. And I don't know any of us, how we would respond to something like that. But that is the way to respond. That is the right way to respond, or the Christian way, or the biblical way, or the Jesus way to respond to something when you've been hurt or slandered or disparaged, to be able to look beyond that to the bigger picture, to be willing to let go of those things so that they too can know the bigger story, which is God. And this is what Paul is wanting to do throughout this letter of 2 Corinthians that we're looking at. This is what Paul is wanting to convey. He's not just talking it, but he's living it. And he's willing to suck it up and eat it for the sake of, in this case, that man that is there. Because Paul understands what God's goal is ultimately. Restore, redeem, reconcile. At the end of that, that BJ read in the story, Paul makes very clear, we are not unaware of Satan's schemes. You know what Satan's schemes are? Division. Broken relationship. That's what he wants. And Paul is aware of that. And Paul recognizes that even if my rights may be to be angry and to hold a grudge and to be bitter for this sort of thing, who wins in the end is Satan that wins in the end. He is the one that wins in the end. And Paul is aware of that. And so he's willing to look at that and go, wait a minute, we can't have this happen. This church needs to be united. This church needs to be a community. We need to be able to restore people when they fall and when they blow it. We've all done it. We've all been there. This man in particular has made a bigger impact maybe than the other people's sins. But I understand that what God's desire is that we're united, that we're community, that we're brothers and sisters headed in one direction with the Lord as our strength. We cannot let Satan defeat us in this. And so Paul sees the big picture. What a great letter this is, because it's a great lesson for us, that we too are in that same boat. We cannot be unaware of Satan's schemes. We don't talk a lot about Satan. We don't talk a lot about the devil on Sunday mornings, but when it comes up, it's very clear where it is, what Paul is saying here. Satan had a plan, and that was to divide that church, destroy that church, and destroy that individual in particular for what's going on. Paul is aware of it, and he says, no way, this is not going to happen. I'll take it. I'll take the burden. I'll take the bullet for the sake of the church, for the sake of this man. Man, that is something for us all to think about and to consider in our lives. Again, whether it's people we love, people we hate, this is an opportunity for us to remember the big picture. Am I working toward reconciliation? Am I working toward redemption? Am I working toward restoration for God and another person that's in my life? Man, let's continue to pray. You don't give up. You continue to move forward. You continue. Not as some count slowness, but you just continue to move. Pray. Continue to live the way that needs to live, because your desire is for that person to be reconciled, restored, redeemed in the Lord. So keep moving. I know there's people in your life, because I know there's people in my life, that it's easy sometimes to get frustrated or just say, forget it. But man, we can't do it. Can't do it. You've got to be aware, of Satan's schemes and trying to keep them isolated and away from the Lord. And we've got to be the ones that stand in that gap instead. Lord, use us in the lives of those people that are in our circle of influence to bring about this reconciliation and restoration with the Lord. Let's be those people that are there. Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for this time. We thank you for this letter. We thank you for your example most of all, and then for Paul's example and countless other people, and even Brant's this morning. Father, the example of seeing you as the big picture and the need for people to come to know you, to love you. Father, to be part of your family. Lord, each one of us in this room at one time have been apart from you. but have now been brought close to you. And so we thank you for that and know what it is to be reconciled and restored. And Father, I pray for those that we know, family members, enemies, people that we love. Lord, those that you bring to our mind, Lord, that we would continue to pray for them, that continue to be people that bring about good, Lord, that want to bring about restoration for them, to draw them to you. Father, let us not be weary about this. Let us not get discouraged. Father, let us not take offense, but Father, rather continue to push forward, drawing them closer to you. Father, again, I thank you for your word that is so timely even today in this era of division and splintering. Father, let us be people that are different. Let us be the people that you have called us to be. Those that unite, those that are one. It's one in your family. We love you, Father, and it is through Jesus we pray. Amen.